A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, Book the Third, The Track of a Storm, Chapter 13, 52. In the black prison of the consigliere, the doomed of the day awaited their fate. They were in a number as the weeks of the year. 52 were the roll that afternoon, on the life tide of the city to the boundless everlasting sea. Before their cells were quit of them, new occupants were appointed. Before their blood ran into the blood spilled yesterday, the blood that was to mingle with theirs tomorrow was already set apart. 212 were told off. From the farmer general of 70, whose riches could not buy his life, to the seamstress of 20, whose poverty and obscurity could not save her, physical diseases, engendered in the vices and neglects of men, will seize on victims of all degrees, and the frightful moral disorder, born of unspeakable suffering, intolerable oppression, and heartless indifference, smote equally without distinction. Charles Darnay, alone in a cell, had sustained himself with no flattering delusion since he came to it from the tribunal. In every line of the narrative he had heard his condemnation. He had fully comprehended that no personal influence could possibly save him, that he was virtually sentenced by the millions, and that units could not avail him, and that units could avail him nothing. Nevertheless, it was not easy, with the face of his beloved wife fresh before him, to compose his mind to what he must bear. His hold on life was strong, and it was very, very hard to loosen. By gradual effort and degrees, unclosed a little here, it clenched the tighter there, and when he brought his strength to bear on that hand, and it yielded, this was closed again. There was a hurry, too, in all his thoughts, a turbulent and heated working of his heart, that contended against resignation. If, for a moment, he did feel resigned, then his wife and child, who had to live after him, seemed to protest and to make it a selfish thing. But all this was at first. Before long, the consideration that there was no disgrace in the fate he must meet, and that numbers went the same road wrongfully, and trod it firmly, every day sprang to stimulate him. Next followed the thought that much of the future peace of mind enjoyable by the dear ones depended on his quiet fortitude, so by degrees he calmed into a better state, when he could raise his thoughts much higher and draw comfort down. Before it had set dark on the night of his condemnation, he had traveled thus far on his last way, being allowed to purchase the means of writing and a light. He sat down to write until such time as the prison lamps should be extinguished. He wrote a long letter to Lucy, showing her that he had known nothing of her father's imprisonment until he had heard of it from himself, and that he had been as ignorant as she of his father's and uncle's responsibility for that misery until the paper had been read. He had already explained to her that his concealment from himself of the name he had relinquished was the one condition, fully intelligible now, that her father had attached to their betrothal, and was the one promise he had still exacted on the morning of their marriage. He entreated her, for her father's sake, never to seek to know whether her father had become oblivious to the existence of the paper, or had it recalled to him, for the moment, or for good, by the story of the tower, on that old Sunday under the dear plane tree in the garden. If he had preserved any definite remembrance of it, there could be no doubt that he had supposed it destroyed with the Bastille. When he found no mention of it among the relics of prisoners, which the populace had discovered there, and which had been described to all the world, he besought her, though he added that he knew it was needless, to console her father by impressing him, through every tender means she could think of, with the truth that he had done nothing for which he could justly reproach himself, but that uniformly forgotten himself for their joint sakes. Next to her preservation of her own last grateful love and blessing, and her overcoming of her sorrow, to devote himself to their dear child, he adjured her, as they would meet in heaven, to comfort her father. To her father himself he wrote in the same strain. But he told her father that he expressly confided his wife and child to his care, and he told him this very strongly, with the hope of rousing him from any despondency or dangerous retrospect toward which he foresaw he might be tending. To Mr. Lorry he commended them all, and explained his worldly affairs. That done, with many added sentences of grateful friendship and warm attachment, all was done. He never thought of Carton. His mind was so full of the others that he never once thought of him. He had time to finish these letters before the lights were put out. When he lay down on his straw bed, he thought he had done with the world, but it beckoned him back in his sleep, and showed itself in shining forms, free and happy, back in the old house in Soho, though it had nothing in it like the real house. Unaccountably, released and light of heart, he was with Lucy again, and she told him it was all a dream, and he had never gone away, a pause of forgetfulness, and then he had even suffered, and had come back to her, dead, and at a peace. And yet there was no difference in him. Another pause of oblivion, and he awoke in the somber morning unconscious where he was or what had happened, until it flashed upon his mind, "This is the day of my death." Thus he had come through the hours to the day when 52 heads would fall, and now, while he was composed, and hoped that he could meet the end with quiet heroism, a new action began in his waking thoughts, which was very difficult to master. He had never seen the instrument that was to terminate his life, how high it was from the ground, how many steps it had, where he would be stood, how he would be touched, whether the touching hands would be dyed red, which way his face would be turned, whether he would be the first or might be the last. These and many similar questions, in no wise direction of his will, obtruded themselves over and over again countless times. Neither were they connected with fear. He was conscious of no fear. Rather, they originated in a strange, besetting desire to know what to do when the time came, a desire gigantically disproportionate to the few swift movements of which it referred, a wondering that was more like the wondering of some other spirit within his than his own. The hours went on as he walked to and fro, and the clock struck the numbers he would never hear again. 9 gone forever, 10 gone forever, 11 gone forever, 12 coming on to pass away. After a hard contest with that eccentric action of thought which had last perplexed him, he had got the better of it. He walked up and down, softly repeating their names to himself. The worst of the strife was over. He could walk up and down, free from distracting fancies, praying for himself and for them. 12 gone forever. He had been appraised that the final hour was 3, and he knew he would be summoned some time earlier, inasmuch as the tumbrils jolted heavily and slowly through the streets. Therefore he resolved to keep 2 before his mind, as the hour, and so to strengthen himself to the interval that he might be able after that time to strengthen others. Walking regularly to and fro with his arms folded on his breast, a very different man from the prisoner who had walked to and fro at La Force, he heard 1 struck away from him without surprise. The hour had measured